Well, to give us more analysis ahead of the summit is James Denslow, a London-based writer on Middle East politics and security issues. James, thank you very much for being with us in the program. First off, French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who's hosting the summit, is facing flack at home and abroad for over what's being seen as colonial grandstanding in North Africa. Now, the question is, will he use the G8 to rally support for the upcoming presidential election?
Well, certainly I think it will do him no harm to be seen as the sort of king amongst statesmen when he's hosting the G8. And I think it'll be very interesting to see exactly what kind of memoranda come out from it. You have to bear in mind that most of the work around the G8 occurs before the actual summit itself. There will be, of course, some degree of bilateral diplomacy that's unexpected, but most agreements will already have been made. And I think there'll be lots of very positive announcements to come out of it vis-à-vis aid to Tunisia and Egypt and the support that the G8 and its other institutions that it supports, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank, will give to these countries in the form of debt relief and loans and what have you. So I think that will be the major sort of positive to come from it. And issues like Libya, where there is huge disagreement amongst the countries concerned, will be rather more confined to the corridors and sort of the more sort of side events. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes out.
Well, we'll return to Libya a little later in the interview, but before that, I'd like to ask you, to what extent do Western G8 members use the summit as a platform for solving their own problems?
Well, as I say, I mean, most of the work happens before, but I think there's a lot of issues clearly which require multilateral cooperation between the powers, whether it's dealing with the world economy or the wars the world faces. It's no surprise that the G8 faces very similar issues each time it meets, because those are the issues that affect the world today. I think it's interesting that Sarkozy is treating the conference slightly differently this year, with inviting Eric Schmidt from Google and Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook to come and address the world leaders. It shows you that there's room for sort of certain degrees of innovation here, but ultimately the core principles of what the G8 will deal with remain the same, and I think we should expect some major announcements to come from it.
Let's talk about Libya now. So do you see the G8 nations involved in NATO's military action in Libya rethink their strategy there after weeks of stalemate?
Well, I think it's very important that the mission drift that's occurred in Libya, the G8 is used as a time to sort of bring back together the international partners to it. I mean, bearing in mind that, OK, the Chinese and the Russians weren't necessarily in favour of the intervention, but they didn't veto it or vote against it at the UN. So, in a sense, we've got a sort of time to renew the mandate there, to be very clear as to whether we are talking about regime change or whether they need to go back to the UN to get a mandate for that. There's been a sort of steady creep as the civil war has become consolidated in the country, and there's talk in the last few days of the British and the French sending in attack helicopters, which will represent another escalation of the conflict somewhat. So I think this is a huge opportunity for those who are the main proponents of the intervention, the British, the French and the Americans, to really sort of test the water on their other alliances, see how the Germans, the Chinese and the Russians in particular feel about the current state of affairs and what will happen next. So it's a very important meeting vis-à-vis Libya, but I say again that it will probably be confined more to the margins of the summit rather than the sort of headlines itself.
Well, James, the summit is taking place against the backdrop of the severe financial crisis both in the States and in Europe. But why is money always found for expensive foreign military campaigns?
Well, bear in mind this is a campaign that's not being fought on realpolitik, but rather liberal interventionism and the responsibility to protect. In particular, will Sarkozy be known as the man who saved the tens of thousands of civilians in Benghazi, or will he be known as the man who brought France to economic ruin in a never-ending war in Libya? It is true that it's a very expensive conflict at a time of global austerity, and I think people certainly in Britain are very sensitive to the fact that each time a typhoon flies around for an hour, it costs us £70,000 as a taxpayer, and the missiles that we're slamming into Libyan and Russian-made tanks are costing us almost $1 million a time. So the war and the economics of war, I think, are certainly more important than ever. However, it's very difficult to put a value on essentially the protection of human life, which is the argument that the leaders in Washington, London and Paris would make. However, at some point we've got to really look back and say, where does this end? Because ultimately it would seem at present that we're heading towards a dynamic a bit like what happened in 1990 in Iraq, completely unforeseen at the time, in which a Kurdish safe haven was created by Western air power in the north, and that could happen today in the east of Libya and certainly areas around Misrata, where you have sort of coalition-protected enclaves in Libya that remain there for potentially decades.
All right, James, thanks very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us here in the program. James Dainslow, a London-based writer on Middle East politics and security issues.